Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. I'm Kasia Madeira. Tonight I'm joined by Tom Newton Dunn, the chief political commentator at Times Radio, and Sonia Sodha, the chief leader writer at The Observer. Lovely to have you both with us. So let's have a look at some of the pages that we already have, and we'll start with the Mirror's front page. It's focusing on the huge logistical challenge of getting pupils back to schools, saying that head teachers will have to stagger the return due to the new testing regime being put in place. Guardian also looking at the announcement made by the Education Secretary today. It highlights the news that teachers will get powers to decide exam grades this year. The Eye's front page looking at a new campaign which is encouraging the public to stay at home and not to drop their guard because of the warmer weather. To next week's budget, the Express reporting warnings from senior Tory MPs to not raise taxes to help people and businesses bounce back from the COVID pandemic. The Daily Mail saying that Rishi Sunak will use the budget next week to pave the way for a post-lockdown boom. And festivals are back. The Metro's front page saying that this summer will rock after all, as festivals announced that they'll be going ahead this year. One of the many stories that we'll be looking at throughout tonight's edition of the papers. So thank you, as always, Tom and Sonia, for joining us tonight. So we're going to start with The Guardian. So, Sonia, let's start with you. This is, we heard today what the Education Secretary was saying, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But The Guardian is looking at what we're expecting to hear tomorrow. It's about exams following the situation that we had in the summer last year. This time it'll be up to the teachers rather than algorithms to decide grades.
That's right. So after the furore of last summer and Gavin Williamson's terrible experience with the algorithm, which he had to U-turn on, the approach that he's decided to take this year is that young people's exam grades, A-levels, GCSEs, other qualifications, will be determined by teacher assessment alone. So lots of papers are reporting this, Guardian's leading on it, a couple of other papers as well. And what it sounds like is that there will be exam papers produced that teachers can sort of set internally and use to inform their judgments, but the judgments will all be done by teachers, and there will be far less moderation than there was last year, and there won't be this algorithm that is used to adjust the grades that teachers award based on how previous years have done at that school. I think there were two big questions for this system, and it may sound great. Oh, brilliant! I'm a young person. It won't be as bad as last year. My teacher's just going to set my grades for me. But I think there are two big questions that have been raised by critics and educational experts. The first is, we know that teacher-based assessment tends to do worse by children and young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, actually, and that's to do with low expectations that some schools can have of young people from poorer backgrounds. And the second is it will lead to grade inflation. We saw a lot of grade inflation last year. I think people think there will be even more as a result of the system. Now, you might say these young people have had a terrible time of it. Doesn't matter if we've got one year group where young people are on average doing much better. But that this can lead to problems, because if there's a lot of grade inflation in one particular year, you might get to a situation where universities and employers sort of look at which year young people did their GCSEs and A-levels in and say, oh, that was a COVID year where they didn't set exams, it was all set by teachers, there was lots of grade inflations, so actually that A in English GCSE isn't really an A in English GCSE. So even though it sounds better for young people, I think that some of the criticisms of this is really out of the best interests of young people, because grade inflation doesn't always serve young people that well.
Yeah, the paper also saying that there are warnings of that extremely high grade inflation. We're going to keep the focus on education, but just turning to the Mirror, because today we had the Gavin Williamson outlining also the extra spending, Tom, that the government will be issuing out to help pupils in England catch up on missed learning, £700 million in funding. When you divide that up amongst schools, it then obviously it's a lot less than that. But what the paper is focusing on is already a situation with the 8th of March, when we were expecting all pupils to return back, but there could already be a problem with that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a fan of Gavin Williamson, and let's face it, there aren't many in Westminster who are anymore, then it really is your day. If you're getting a double dose, you had him today and you had him tomorrow, he's going to make a statement in the Commons tomorrow outlining his plan for grading, no longer exams, which would be teacher assessments. And of course, we had the funding today, the catch-up funding. The Mirror are zeroing in on something that's been around for a day or two, that's sort of building in steam, really, which is the government's promise to bring back schools on March the 8th, which was greeted by jubilation by everybody, of course, parents and kids especially. The problem is that with the way that government wants to bring them back, with the mass testing, lateral flow testing regime, it's a huge logistical operation that will almost certainly see teachers and children tied up for at least a day or two, if not most of the week, trying to get this thing up and running. Huge amounts of teachers, huge amounts of space in schools set aside to get every kid through, tested, and twice. So the argument being, they probably won't see much teaching going on for much of that week. I suppose I have a modicum of sympathy for Gavin Williamson on both these stories, actually, which is, again, a hugely rare thing in Westminster these days. In a way, he's sort of damned if he does or damned if he doesn't on both. If he doesn't test, which is a very difficult, long, painful process, if you like, then he runs the risk of mass outbreaks of coronavirus in schools and has to close them all down again. Likewise with exams, it's a similar sort of argument. He's really damned if he does or damned if he doesn't. It's really, really hard to come up with a single uniform system to test all 2 or 3 million kids in the country, or 1.2 million, I think it is, doing GCSEs and A-levels, when they've had such incredibly different varieties of education, excellent education from some, down to almost nothing to others. So it's kind of like testing apples against pears, or strawberries or bananas, or a fuller range of different fruit, really. But as I say, you won't find huge amounts of sympathy for Mr. Williamson these days.
And when it comes to, because of course, you know, homeschooling, this remote learning, we know it was never, Sonia, meant to have been a long-term option, but here we are. How do you feel about teachers and vaccinations, given that we're now at 18 million people in the country being vaccinated? We've just had half term. We hear people saying that perhaps teachers should have been vaccinated during that time to make a return back to school quicker.
Well, we did see Labour call for this proposal a few weeks ago. But I mean, I think the JCVI, which is the Independent Scientific Advisory Committee, which advises the government on its vaccination programme and its vaccination schedule, have been really clear that the primary objective of the vaccination programme is to reduce deaths and to alleviate pressure on the NHS. And they've always been very clear that vaccinating the top 9 priority groups, so that's over 50s and the clinically vulnerable, is the way to reduce the number of deaths. Now, vaccinating teachers is obviously a nice thing to do, and we'd all really like to do it. But the thing is, when you've got a finite supply of vaccines that you're rolling out, if you vaccinate teachers, that means that you are not reducing avoidable deaths elsewhere in the population amongst people who are more clinically vulnerable. So I think it's important to emphasise that teachers who are clinically vulnerable will have got vaccinated. I think in the next phase of rollout, there is a really good case for vaccinating people at the front line and people in high-risk jobs before the rest of us who can all work from home. But the issue is that it's not as easy as it sounds, and it's not as obvious as it sounds. So, for example, we know that at far higher risk than teachers are, for example, men in low-skill work in factories that are poorly ventilated, where you have to talk loudly, so like meat processing plants, taxi drivers, for example. And I think JCVI have looked at this issue, and what we're hearing is that the advice to government is probably actually that they should just carry on vaccinating down the age brackets, because once you start trying to sort people by occupation and profession, that's a big logistical exercise that kind of slows you down and prevents you from vaccinating people as quickly as possible. So I think these are really tricky, thorny issues, but I personally think that the JCVI were right to say that the primary objective has to be reducing deaths.
OK, well, let's stay with coronavirus and focus on the eye now, which is looking at the stay-at-home order. A rise in rule breaking is the concern, Tom, and this is, we've been hearing so much about the roadmap to unlocking the country. We're all focusing on that 21st of June date, even though we were told it should be data, not date. But we've got now a new campaign warning the public not to get ahead of themselves, I guess is one way of putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a new campaign that began tonight. First TV moving adverts on screens this evening, catchily entitled "Let's Keep Going," which, of course, does what it says on the tin. And this is the government, I think, having a big concern now. Although levels of compliance at the moment are still pretty high. I was on a train this evening and it was empty still. I'm a key worker. I've got to go in and out to work, so I have to use it, sadly. But levels of compliance are still really good. The concern with government is, now that the roadmap is out there, now that you can see these sort of various finishing posts signposted up ahead, people will begin to start thinking, well, it's okay to start going out again. Maybe they'll see plummeting rates of infection down really low in places like London and the southeast now, and think, well, it's okay and it's now safe to go out and about. This, of course, would delay the entirety of the roadmap and get a lot of people quite sick again. So what do? Well, you try and ram home the message. You've got to keep on going. And we all have to hope it works, really, because, of course, if it doesn't, then that finishing post is forever going to be, quite some way in the distance.
And when it comes to ramming home the message, the Daily Mail is looking at the budget next week, and they're describing this as a booster for the UK, helpfully highlighting it in a syringe. Sonia, talk us through what we are expecting to hear from Rishi Sunak in a much-needed post-lockdown booster injection, for an economy injection, I guess, is one.
Yeah, so the Daily Mail are looking forward to what it predicts will be a big economic fiscal stimulus, maybe even stretching to things like free high street vouchers for shoppers, to reducing levels of alcohol duty for hard-pressed pubs, who've obviously been closed for a really long time now. And obviously, I think it's thinking exactly along the right lines. It's been an incredibly unprecedentedly tough time for the economy over the last 12 months, and it absolutely is in need of a fiscal stimulus. And I think that is definitely something that we can expect to see. It's interesting because the Daily Mail are focusing very much on that side of things, a stimulus, whereas on the front of some of the other papers, we've got a debate that is playing out around tax and at what point the Chancellor should raise taxes. And interestingly, a few of the papers have got the story that the Chancellor is thinking about increasing corporation tax over the duration of a parliament. Now, that's coming from some criticism, obviously, from business groups who say this is not the time to increase business taxation. But it's interesting because corporation tax is a tax on profit. And there are obviously some businesses who've done really well over the last year: supermarkets, online retail, hand sanitizer productions, for example. So, you might argue that actually it's sort of fine to increase tax on profits, but just make sure that you're channeling a lot of support into businesses that are struggling, and encouraging businesses to invest, which actually cuts to corporation tax don't necessarily do. And there have been huge cuts to corporation tax over the last decade. We've now got one of the lowest corporation tax rates in the OECD. So it's interesting that the Chancellor is also thinking about some potential tax rises.
We'll talk about that at a bit more length in the next edition of the papers, but we're running out of time. So let's just crack on to the FT. We've got Narendra Modi, India basically doing phenomenally well in the cricket. Tom, don't know if you're a fan, but this stadium, this absolutely the biggest stadium in the world, has now been renamed after Narendra Modi. Yeah, quite something, actually.
Yeah, unfortunately, I did watch a bit of the cricket today. England, not that we need to remind everyone of our misery, 112 all out, and India going pretty strongly now close to play. So not a great day for the England cricket team, and we were looking good in the series too. But the game was played, in fact, the inaugural game at this enormous new stadium in Ahmedabad. Seats 110,000 people, not seating many people in at the moment, of course, because the pandemic is still raging. But some surprise when Modi decided to name it not after a legendary former Indian Prime Minister, but of course himself, which is highly unprecedented. No one really names things after themselves of great magnanimous, unless they're dictators and despots, which of course Narendra Modi isn't. He's duly elected, but he is a populist in the fine tradition of them. It was sort of almost reminiscent of someone else, another very recent former leader, the other side of the Atlantic used to do such things. And Modi goes in for these sort of big displays. He builds the world's biggest statues. Everything has to be big to give some symbolism to his perhaps a little more nationalistic project for India than other leaders before him. It does seem to work, is the conclusion. I do have to tell you, he does remain quite popular. His critics loathe him for it, but the voters are still rewarding him.
Sonia, your thoughts? What does this say about the man himself? His leadership style, there, of course, but it's quite a telling thing to do.
Yeah, well, I think it shows what a populist he is. There's actually a quote in that story, one of his political opponents calling him a narcissist. And I mean, calling a massive cricket stadium after yourself, perhaps there's a point. I mean, Tom was very diplomatic there. I would probably just go further and call him, you know, India's Trump. He's an incredibly divisive nationalist leader. You know, he sort of subscribed his version of Hindu nationalism. He's very kind of anti-Muslim, which has created real issues in India, real divisions, particularly around Kashmir, for example. So he is absolutely a sort of right-wing populist, and you know, we all know the sort of hazards that come with that.
Indeed we do. Let's end with the Metro, which is, well, the headline is festivals are back. I mean, it's referring to Reading and Leeds Festival, which is at the end of August, but it's an optimistic headline, Tom. Not sure if you've bought your tickets yet, but it does potentially give a much needed boost to the industry.
It really does. Leeds, Reading, and also Latitude in Suffolk, which is very much sort of a middle-class festival with Pink Sheep, which I have attended, I have to say, in the past. It's extraordinary, the fact that a summer festival should be a front-page headline on a newspaper. It really goes to show the level of rectitude we've all been locked up in, really, and also the incredible pace of unlock. This is only 4 or 5 months away, but it really is exciting to think that hundreds of thousands of people can all gather together in such a short period of time. I mean, I almost don't want to believe it. I'd certainly like to go back to Latitude again if I can get a ticket. And I can imagine there'll be phenomenal parties as well when the great unlocks happen. Although you do suddenly wonder how. I mean, I presume you'll either have to show your vaccination passport or certification as the government first to see it on the gate when you get in, or have to do a lateral flow test. You can imagine the queues to doing a lateral flow test getting into a festival the size of those.
Yes, if you think about the queues to the bathrooms. Anyway, let's gloss over that, and we're going to leave it there for the time being. We will talk more at length. Of course, important to say Glastonbury has been cancelled, so not all festivals are back on. Thank you, Tom. Sonia, don't go away from your computer screens, because we'll be bringing you up to date with more of the papers as and when we get them. And we will indeed be back with our guests in about half an hour's time. I hope you can join us then. Bye-bye for now.